Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's BESA webinar. Big topic today. Seems to be very popular because there's been a big upsurge in registrations for this, which is nice to see. And for those who haven't joined us before, our usual format is to quickly run through a presentation, and the main event is a Q&A with our expert panel. Building owners and managers have become increasingly aware of the importance of fire safety risk assessments in the wake of the Grenfell tragedy. As a result, the role of fire and smoke dampers has gained attention, and this has obvious implications for fire and smoke damper testing regimes. The subject matter is covered in our publication DW145, but with that being currently under review and a more urgent need for this maintenance guidance to be made publicly available, we've brought this section forward and published it as a standalone guidance note, VH001. It will be integrated into DW145 as that gets updated, but for now it will be a standalone section. I'm extremely grateful to my technical committee as always for this guidance, and very pleased to have three of the main protagonists in the publication of VH001. Today we have George Friend, who is CEO of Ventilation Surveys and Services, and he's also chair of our Event Hygiene Group. We have Richard Norman, who's Managing Director of In-Depth Services. And first of all, we have Peter Rogers, who is an independent consultant who we use on all things ventilation and duct related. So Peter, if I can ask you to join me, please.
Good afternoon,
Peter. How are you?
Fine, thank you very much. Yep, thank you.
Good.
All good.
Good to see you as always on here. You're an old hand at these now, so you know the score.
So say that.
So I'm going to disappear while you do your bit of presentation. I will come back when you're done, and we'll see how the chat goes afterwards. Okay.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, on this beautiful sunny afternoon. Well, it is here in Oxford anyway, so I hope it is with you. So thank you for joining us today. And as Graham mentioned earlier, building owners and managers are becoming increasingly aware of the problems and importance of fire safety in the wake of the Grenfell fire. So BESA have actually updated our fire and smoke damper maintenance document to help people actually see how they can actually look after their buildings from a fire safety point of view. So where do we stand at the moment? Well, BS 9999 says that all fire dampers should be treated tested by a competent person at regular intervals not exceeding 1 year, and to be repaired or replaced immediately if found to be faulty. Spring-operated fire dampers should be tested annually, and fire dampers situated in dust-laden or similar atmospheres should be tested much more frequently at periods suited to the degree of pollution. Now, spring-operated fire dampers are commonly designed to activate when temperatures exceed the manufacturer's predetermined threshold, which is typically 72 degrees C, and the fusible link releases. The spring-loaded fire damper will then release and contain the fire and hot gases to prevent the spread of fire. Some building owners and managers are completely unaware that they actually even had fire dampers, and they're certainly not aware that they need to test them to comply with the fire safety legislation. So obviously at BESA, we would strongly recommend that you use a contractor who complies with the latest documents, DW145 of course, and also this particular document, VH001. So next slide, please. So installation. To enable the fire damper to be tested and reset, access panels need to be installed. And access panels should need to be quick release, insulated sealed panels, all manufactured and installed to the BESA specification DW144, which is the sheet metal ductwork specification. And the required location of these are shown in that specification, and they're also shown in TR19 Greece Table 3, which is also a BESA publication, and it actually also tells you who's responsible for actually positioning the panel. So TR19 is a fire risk management of grease accumulation within kitchen extract ducts. Where there is restricted access to enable full testing and maintenance of the fire damper, you may need to consider actually removing certain duct sections to actually get at the actual work. And there's a little note we've got to the side of the slide there, which I want to make you aware of, that Ductwork and ductwork supports are not designed for man access, either inside or on top of the duct. So that means that if you're checking any fire dampers, you can't use the ductwork for putting a ladder against or to lean against, put your tools on or anything like that. Please be aware that your engineers do not use the ductwork for any form of supporting at all. This is really, really important, and we do cover that in DW144 also. So next slide, please, Martina. Kitchen extract ventilation. Well, BS 999 again will tell you that you shouldn't have fire dampers in kitchen extract ventilation systems. You may still find some dampers in old systems, and if this is the case, then they should be tested annually as a minimum. But ideally, really, you should plan to have the fire dampers removed from the kitchen ventilation system. We would strongly recommend that. And again, the BESA standard specification for kitchen ventilation DW172 will actually also tell you this, as well as with many other items. Next slide, please. Testing. Obviously, prior to testing, you need to carry out a full risk assessment. And probably one of the first things you might want to do is to review any previous inspection reports which may be available, and possibly drawings, so you can actually locate your dampers and see what should have been done last time. Check, of course, if any notes were put on that last risk assessment. Make sure that any amendments and modifications have been carried out. And then your test should include, obviously there's a big long list in the VH001, this is just a few from that list. You need an inventory of all the dampers to be tested. And again, where dampers are fitted, you may need to consider accessibility to small sized ducts, because sometimes it's restricted access and you may need to get ceilings or something removed to actually get access to actually some of these fire dampers which are installed. There may be some ductwork or pipework services as well in the way, so this sometimes causes a bit of a major problem. All manually resettable dampers need to be released to ensure integrity of the spring-loaded system. I'm just closing my little slide there, which has come out some of the information. And on motorized fire dampers, control mode should operate to ensure that blades are moving from the open and closed position and vice versa. The fusible link should be inspected for any deformity or damage, and where accessibility allows, the fire/smoke damper should be cleaned in its entirety. The fire damper should be locally activated or released mechanically and reset again in its correct position. Next slide, please. So your report, again, you need to check with the previous report, as I said earlier, to make sure that modifications have been carried out. And if they haven't been carried out, of course, your new report needs to actually state this. And again, this is just a few items which are listed in the VH001, but your test report should include client information, the date, the name of the operative, register to include the damper location and ID number, and where the damper is not fully accessible due to inadequate access, you may need to make a note of that as well. Inspection results, including details of any failed operation, and an explanation perhaps of what the failed operation is and what recommended corrective action needs to be taken. Report any damage or corrosion to failed fusible links, and where lubrication is required, make sure that you use the damper manufacturer's specific instructions to follow any lubrication. If this is not available, then a PTFE lubricant should be used to minimize any adhesion of dust. Provide photographic evidence of the damper condition prior, during, and after testing, and also provide evidence of any issues that require the client to take remedial action. It's very easy these days to provide this sort of information, and it's very, very good information, obviously, to provide to the client. Next slide, please. SFG 20 is the BESA definitive standard for planned maintenance and sets out specific instructions required for various things. And this is the recommendation that asks for all fire dampers and smoke dampers, any mechanical fire and smoke dampers, intumescent fire dampers, air transfer dampers, or thermal fused intumescent air valves. And you'll see that all of these dampers have a critically high level of maintenance, and they should be maintained frequently as a minimum of 12 months. And that maintenance should be carried out by a competent person with the right skills for this particular duty. I'm hoping that perhaps one of my colleagues on the panel will actually be able to throw a bit more light on competent persons and training. So we'll hopefully come back to that later on. Next slide, please, Martina. Legislation. With the enactment of the regulatory reform, Fire Safety Order in 2005 in England and Wales, it is now the employer's responsibility to maintain their fire safety systems. I don't think everybody is aware of that. So all managers and building owners are responsible for their own fire safety systems, so they need to be aware of that. In Scotland, separate fire service and fire safety legislation was introduced, and the Fire of Scotland regulation was in 2006, and plus I believe there are a number of other relevant fire safety documents, and there's more information available on the Scottish Government website. Northern Ireland, the fire safety regulations in Northern Ireland were introduced in 2010. I think one thing to note with all reforms and safety orders and regulations that there are, for clarification, there's no exception that to comply with any requirement to do with fire safety order, there's no risk-based assessment that can remove the requirement to test fire and smoke dampers annually as a minimum. So all of these documents will tell you that all fire and smoke dampers have to be tested at a minimum every 12 months. And I know that's not happening at the moment. Next slide, please, Martina. Well, here we have it. We have the revised version of VH001. It's the second version. It is now available free to everybody, and I believe that the link will be available on the webinar for you later on. I suggest that you all pick up and read it, and I hope that you will find it very useful. And I look forward to perhaps talking to you with any questions that may come up from the audience. So thank you very much. That's me for the time being. I think we finished the slides, so I'll hand back to you, Graham.
Thanks very much for that, Peter. You were very quick through that. I was expecting another 5 minutes, just while I was paying attention.
I do apologise, but you actually pinched some of my lines, Graham.
Oh, I do apologise. No, thanks very much. That was really good, Peter. You really summarised it very well. If I can ask Richard Norman and George Friend to join us now. Q&A.
Hello.
Good afternoon, chaps. How are we?
Afternoon, very good.
Good.
Thank you.
Afternoon. If I can kick off, I mean, I think that you both agree that was a good summary of where we are and why we've produced the guidance. If we can maybe kick off with an indication of what the size of the market is. Richard, can you give us an idea of the number of dampers that need regular testing in the UK?
Well, these are obviously estimates, but we think from CIBSE, the information we have is that there are 300,000 new dampers put into the buildings in the UK every year. As a simple estimate, that's probably only 1% of all buildings. So on that basis, there are probably 30 million or more dampers that are present in the UK. So in terms of market size, if they were tested annually as a minimum, then the value of the market is probably in excess of £500 million annually. So an enormous market. Wow.
Which is reflected in probably in the numbers that have signed up for this webinar, I guess, is how big that market is and how important the market is. George, you're very much a hands-on practitioner in the sector. In terms of how an inspection is carried out, is a visual inspection acceptable? Visual inspection only?
No, it's not, and that's a bit of a misnomer, really. Everything that you read about in VH001 and BS *9, it says testing. It doesn't mention inspection, so it's all about actually testing the fire dampers, not simply inspecting them. So the key thing to focus on is that it's about testing and maintaining those dampers. Obviously, what happens when you go to a real world scenario is you sometimes are unable to actually undertake the testing and the maintenance because they might be blocked, in which case at that point in time you may be only limited to a visual inspection of the element, but that would not be compliant, and you would need to identify that and come up with a methodology to be able to do the testing and the maintenance going forward on that particular component.
Okay. So a lot of the testing that's getting done isn't actually adequate at the moment then?
I would say that there is, yeah, people are going around and delivering something that's giving no real value. The value from this comes from the testing and the maintenance, so that you are verifying that that component is working correctly and that it's in a good, clean state, so that it can continue to operate in that condition. And that's why it's important to do it annually. And as Peter identified in his slides earlier, where you have these environments where you have very quick build-up of contamination and dust and debris on these elements, they will need inspecting more frequently. Just like with fire doors in a building, if you have a fire door that is a very busy thoroughfare and in high use, you would potentially on your risk assessment assess that fire door more frequently than you would perhaps on a riser cupboard.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's quite scary, Graham, that there are so many buildings out there, whether it be a shopping centre or a hospital or office block, that people just are not aware that they actually have fire dampers installed. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands where they've just not been located. So, you know, I think the first thing is just to find these fire dampers as well. And you won't find drawings with them on. You can if it's all been done properly, but in the older systems, probably no records of them at all, or not available anyway. So
okay, on that point then, how do we check then if a fire damper is installed, and where to find where it's located in the building?
You need to know what you're looking for, of course. You'll have to, if there are no drawings at all available, depending on how complicated the systems are, you'll have to trace all the way through the system. Hopefully there will be some sort of drawings available which might tell you which are the firewalls and fire breaks, but sometimes, George and Richard, I'm sure will confirm, they might just have to trace the ductwork and follow all the way through until they can just make sure that there is or there isn't fire dampers.
Yeah, I think it's important that even with schematics or drawings, that you have to follow go through every part of the building, because often, as I'm sure George will confirm, the information is either out of date or incorrect. So you can't, even with that data, you just can't rely upon it entirely.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah, about the golden thread, isn't it, that we've talked about in these webinars a lot. It's that following the changes to the building and collating all the information as a package together, so that you have confidence that you're identifying all of these dampers. And that's again why it's important to do this annually, because things do change, and so you revisit that on an annual basis as a minimum to give you confidence that you are covering that building adequately on those different elements.
Yeah. Peter, you mentioned in the presentation about checking for corrosion, and that's quite handily opened up to one of the questions. Sorry, can you guys hear me? Because I'm just getting a message saying lost sound.
Yep.
Yeah, it must just be that. It must just be Martin has lost sound. Sorry, you mentioned in the presentation about checking for corrosion of the dampers, spring loading and things like that. A question in from one of the audience members is saying they have issues with fire dampers in systems serving swimming pool environments. So obviously there's going to be very corrosive atmosphere with a high chlorine. Typically corrosive defined as C4 in the British Standard. We have not found a supplier with DOPs or certification for the use of galvanized or stainless steel dampers in this environment. Do you have any comments or knowledge on this?
Well, that's very true. Most fire dampers probably won't suit a swimming pool environment, depending on what the swimming pool is actually being cleaned with. But there may be instances perhaps where they might need to consider using an intumescent fire damper in place of a mechanical one, where people have actually installed the mechanical ones. That obviously does need to be checked regularly, more regularly perhaps than the 12 months, to make sure that it doesn't corrode. If they find that it's corroding badly, then they might need to replace it with possibly an intumescent style of fire damper, depending on the environment. But of course, again, you have to be careful with that, because your system pressure might not be large enough, if you like, to cope with an intumescent fire damper, because the resistance is much, much higher than a normal fire damper. So yeah, you do need to be very much aware of what's happening, especially with swimming pools. I don't think there's a damper on the market other than incandescent, which would probably be suitable for every condition. The stainless steel isn't always the best for swimming pools either. So
Yeah,
I think you need some specialist help, I think, on that.
The limitations of the incandescent as well is that they're not an automated fire smoke damper can be integrated with the whole fire control strategy, whereas an incandescent damper is just purely a passive means of controlling the fire. So that has its limitations. So yeah, it's, again, as Peter said, it might be that you need more regular inspection on those items to just identify it needs to be budgeted for, that it has a reduced lifespan than it would have intended in normal use.
Yeah.
Yeah, replace them more often.
Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. It's always a problem area, isn't it? Swimming pool environments.
Yeah, it definitely is. Just for the ductwork as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or can be. Yeah.
One point for clarification, Richard, you mentioned this the figure of 300,000 dampers a year being installed in new buildings. The question is that specifically fire dampers or all dampers?
I don't know. It was data that came out from a third party. George, do you know any answer to that?
No, it is fire dampers.
It is fire dampers. It was based on some initial numbers came from Belimo, who make the actuators. So they have a good handle on numbers going out to market to be installed on the differing types. So that number was actually about 250,000 for automated fire and smoke dampers. So if you add on there the mechanical dampers as well, spring loaded, then that number could actually be even higher than Richard's suggesting, but we're quite confident it's at least 300,000 per annum.
Yeah.
I think the point is that it's highly unlikely that new builds only account for 1% of all building stock. But trying to use some comparative and explanatory figures saying if it's only 1%, it gives you an idea that there are then over 30 million dampers. I would imagine there could be nearer to 100 million dampers in buildings within the UK, but we weren't trying to over-egg it.
It is scary. I mean, you just take, I mean, a hospital, for example, could easily have 10,000 dampers. It could easily be that. It's quite scary how many fire dampers that there are actually in the industry.
Yeah.
And how many in the industry that aren't known?
Yeah.
And another question that's kind of related to that, actually, I guess, is good afternoon. In my building, I have fire dampers and volume control dampers. What is the difference, please?
Well, one controls fire and one controls air. There's no comparison really. They might possibly look the same. They might both have blades, but volume control damper is obviously there to set the air volumes, and whereas a fire damper is to control spread of fire, and it only operates when there is a fire.
It should be noted there are some quite clever new style volume fire dampers which also do act as volume control dampers. So they have a dual role, but a volume control damper, as Peter says, that is purely to control air. So a mixed use damper which will do fire damper and volume control. They are there in the marketplace. I think BSB make one which has an external handle for resetting, and you can set the volume by the position of the handle on the side. They're actually a very nice style of damper because they're fitted normally to spiral, which are particularly problematic for us to test when they're smaller. So where you have this external lever, that helps with the resetting operation. But then obviously it's important to mark that when the building's been commissioned, so you don't reset to a random place and mess up all the airflows around the building.
Yeah, good old marker pens. And it's certainly my experience when I installed volume control dampers, they didn't have the same kind of seal on them that would have been rated for use as a fire damper or smoke damper. So
no, they probably won't be positioned in walls either, Graham. So
yeah,
they shouldn't be.
Shouldn't be, yeah. Okay. Positioning of the dampers then. This might be a good one for George. I know, George, you come across some really horrendous examples of installation without access. What percentage of dampers would you suggest are inaccessible?
It's unique to building, but I always say when I meet a customer, on our first year's inspection, we anticipate about 25% as potentially being not accessible, and that's through different reasons. You know, other services interfering with us getting to the damper, fixed ceilings, lack of provision of the correct number of access doors. There should be one either side. There may only be one on one side quite often. So there's lots of different reasons why we may not be able to get to a damper fully to test and maintain it. But yeah, general rule for 25%. We've been to some buildings where that number's been 90%, and scarily, that's in new build as well. It's not just existing stock. We find a lot of problems in new build. After this call, I'm actually going to a site to do a walk around with a customer because they're experiencing problems with accessibility and they want to do that at the construction phase, which is good to see, but that happens quite rarely at the moment, and it needs to be a lot more common. They need specialist contractors coming in for handover and saying, yes, I can get to those dampers. It's a really important part of the process.
I think that, George, you will have experienced the same as us, that it's not untypical for a client to have a building that's either been tested historically on a number of occasions, or it's a new build, as you say. We do our testing, 20% or more are untestable, can't be reached, inaccessible. And the first conversation with the client is obviously one of them being quite defensive, understandably, until an explanation is made to show that no, these are not accessible. And it's just, sadly, it's not untypical.
So what would you say best practices then? Is if you've gone to site then, Richard, you found that the fire, you know, there's fire dampers in a section of duct and you found it to be inaccessible. What would be the next step that you would take there?
I think this is the key development within the industry, really. The old tick list bit of saying, you know, oh yeah, there's a damper there, tick, and that was all that was ever done, is now really evolved to ensuring that professional companies need to undertake the testing, but also to provide details and solutions to any issues or problems. Now that it's obviously simple if it's a situation that is inaccessible because we weren't allowed in the room, but I'm talking beyond that in terms of, no, there needs a builder's hatch, it's inaccessible, or it needs an access panel, etc. And I think that's where the industry has definitely changed for the better. More and more companies are ensuring that they give the client not just these, we've tested these, but over to you, here's your problem with the ones we can't test, but a solution to that and a program. You know.
Yeah, and obviously longer term with the golden thread, as George mentioned earlier, that it's coming in with the building safety bill, for example. All that kind of thread of information is going to have to be there, isn't it, with the evidence of proper testing.
Yeah,
with
we
that
get the
in mind,
new builds right. That'd be a help, that's for sure.
Yeah, that would certainly be a big help. Yeah.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, with the kind of the longer term and trying to improve compliance and raise compliance, I guess, across the board, what financial penalties can be applied if you're found to be not maintaining fire dampers? And the reason this has been asked by an audience member is that they've raised it with their budget holders for a site, and there's been a delay in getting a response. So risk of penalty may help with tracking of heels.
Well, the ultimate penalty is that the building isn't going to protect itself in the event of a fire.
That's right.
You lose the building or part of the building, and potentially you lose life. You know, that is the ultimate. It's not just a financial cost. There's a cost of life here. These are life safety critical systems. That's what they're there for. They're there to protect life, and they're there to protect the property. They have a specific job to do. They're designed in that way. They're installed in that way. So is there a financial penalty? Not that I've seen in my experience. It's more about the people realise their obligations under legislation to protect the buildings and the occupants. You know, that's the fire regulatory reform order. But you know, you spend a lot of money installing these things into the systems for a reason. Why would you not maintain them? You know, the cost of installing them is far greater than that cost of maintaining them and cleaning them. So, you know, it's like buying an expensive car and then not servicing it, and it breaks down in 2 years' time. You just wouldn't do it. So, you know, you buy that building, you pay for that building, maintain it, budget for it within your maintenance cost. It's an essential part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's
Grenfell.
insurance might not cover as well. Of course, if you had a fire and the fire systems aren't up to date or fire dampers aren't installed correctly, insurance probably won't want to pay out for any fire.
I think the ultimate liability and risk is being played out currently in court out the back of Grenfell.
Grenfell, yeah.
You know,
Yeah, I was going to say that the Grenfell podcast has really put that into stark relief, hasn't it? About the complete lack of management down that chain, and this is a good example of that, I guess.
In terms of ultimate liability for a contractor, there is corporate manslaughter. There is the risk of obviously insolvency, let alone anything else. But there's more than that. I think the repercussions out the back of Grenfell will be felt ongoing after these court cases that will come out.
Mm-hmm. This isn't really something that you can value engineer. It's quite simple. They need to be tested and maintained once a year. You can't value engineer this out. You can make them easier to access, which might mean that you get some cost savings from the maintenance process because they're easier to do. You could design the buildings better so that they're easier to access. You could maybe put more automated ones in your systems, which is becoming more prevalent from what we're seeing. They are easier to clean and maintain and test than the old mechanical styles, but they're more expensive to fit. So there's all those sort of things to take into consideration.
Yeah, I think some people come up with schemes as well where they perhaps have we do 25% this year and 25% the next year and 25% on a 4-year plan. Well, that isn't right. Again, every fire damper, it's not 25% of them. Every fire damper should be tested and maintained annually, minimum.
We've had this conversation. Peculiarly, it seems to be particularly relevant in the healthcare environment, where I actually had a conversation with someone who explained that there was a logic behind the idea of testing non-critical dampers on a less frequent basis than annually, and it was because ductwork systems in hospitals are, of course, so clean, which anyone who's ever seen that's the false premise that I think it's all been based on.
I like to use car analogies, so I will say to my customers or potential customers, okay, well then only put your seatbelt on once in every 4 journeys. Because that's what you're saying. I'm not going to crash this time, so it's okay. We'll put it on next time because that's when we're going to crash. You just don't know. You have to test them.
Okay. Yeah, I like that one. I'm going to move on. Before I do, there's an awful lot of questions coming in about access issues. So I'm going to pose one more to you just to before we move on a little bit. Yeah, we often come across issues, for example, with access to dampers due to tenant fit-outs in commercial buildings. Can you please share some of your experience of dealing with access issues and any advice on resolving them? I know we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but there's a lot of questions on this one. So, any practical advice on how to deal with it?
So I guess you've got to come up with a plan, a strategy of how to deal with it, and it might mean moving some of the equipment that's been installed. It's in the way. I don't think there's any choice to that. I mean, George and Richard probably seen this firsthand, I'm sure. Over to you guys.
Go on, Richard.
Well, no, it's just there should be a fire strategy somewhere for the building. That obviously, it's a little bit like 20 years ago asking for the asbestos summary of the building. But it is a problem. We have it with we've had it recently with a couple of buildings in London where the biggest issue is actually getting the tenants to provide access rather than anything else.
Well, when you come across a situation, then, because there's another question that's a similar vein. There's asking about builder work, and it's talking about historic installations. So when you come across an installation that doesn't meet the standards today, you can't get access to it. Who is actually responsible for that? So obviously, you say you can put a plan of action into place to actually do some rectification. You could move some equipment to give you access temporarily or permanently. Who's responsible for that? Is it the building owner?
The responsible person. whoever the
Yeah.
responsible person may be, and it might be a multitude of people if there's more than one tenant, but the responsible person has the liability under the fire safety order, and that's the long and the short of it. And if you've got an issue that is clearly a fire issue, a risk, that a hazard has been identified and needs to be either eliminated or minimised, then that's it. This is just one aspect of FSO compliance.
Yeah,
it's just that Richard said the important thing. It's about minimising that risk as far as you can. So, you know, we've had sites where we've had to install gantries in loft spaces, you know, specialist steel structures, just to get us up to the fire damper. But under the CDM regs, you know, there's a requirement for that. So we have fixed permanent access in place in some cases where it's very, very difficult to get to them off normal means that you would use, which would ordinarily be step ladders, because of the short duration of work that these tasks tend to be. But you might need some bespoke work being done to that building to do it. There could be the case that you just cannot get to one of them or two of them. But if you have 1,000 dampers in the building and you've worked through that process to leave you with only 2 that you can't get to, you could then reasonably demonstrate that you have minimised the risk as far as you could.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes, of course, the access panel itself is not accessible or even big enough, or not existing even. Many times it's, as you say, the wrong side of the damper, or it's underneath some pipe work, and also above pipe work, you just can't get at it. So there's many instances we just can't get to maintain it. But I suppose you have to go plan through these situations and gradually sort them out. On new buildings, as I say, we should be starting that from the beginning, of course, and
okay.
I think the thing with access panels, I know George and I have discussed this at length, but access panels under any specification that should be followed should be on either side of that damper. The reality is, the key is to ensure that if one access panel facilitates full access for maintenance and testing, then great. You can make a note to tell the client, look, this isn't fully compliant, but the end or the objective is to maintain a test. George, anything to add on that?
Yeah, that's true. You should have 2. It is possible to do a test and maintenance activity with 1, but that doesn't negate the fact that you should have 2 there, because the reason there are 2 when we ask for 2 is, should a damper fail or get wedged, you may need someone to go the other side of the fire compartment in order to assist in being able to reset that damper. Or, you know, as we said, one door may have been fitted just as the system was installed, but they then may have altered that room slightly. So getting access via that panel may be slightly more awkward than perhaps going to the other side. Dampers close and lock in, especially the spring-loaded ones. So it's far easier to open them from one side than it is from another. So if we failed all dampers that don't have a door either side, there wouldn't be many that pass.
No.
It's a remedial action that needs to be done in the next 12 months.
Some of them aren't easy to actually open and close either, of course, without losing a finger. So you've got to be pretty careful about what you're doing as well, haven't you? So you do need as much access as you can. So it's not to be done by someone that's not trained to do it either, of course. Because
you would almost think you've seen these questions, Peter, because that segued so neatly into what I was going to ask next.
Oh, right. No, I hadn't seen them.
Training and competence, because I think you know what we're talking about. A lot of the things we're talking about with the access, the lack of access, the way these systems are installed that don't maybe allow access because of other services or whatever. A lot of that probably comes down to competence of the installer or the designer and or the designer. And I know that's something, George, you and I have talked before about the competence of various different things. Question from the audience: where is the training to become competent available? So, is this generally internal competence assessment provided by contractors, or is there a defined pathway to achieving competence?
There is no defined pathway yet for competence for this. It's a relatively new industry. People's eyes have been opened, hence why there's quite a good uptake on this webinar. This is fairly new. There are independent training schemes out there that people have set up. They are not in general mapped to sort of national vocational standards as of yet. We've got ductwork installers on the installation side. There's been apprentice schemes in place for those, but a lot of ductwork installers don't actually go through formal competencies, which is why we get left with installs that aren't fit for purpose or aren't done correctly. And then the testing needs to be, the important thing is you need to understand, as if you're going out doing this testing, that you're confident your staff are competent to do that task in accordance with VH001. And that would be, you know, experience, real world scenarios that they've witnessed, and then some independent assessment of them doing the task and understanding the elements of why they're doing the task as well, why it's important. So we don't yet, and we're pushing for it with BESA at the moment as subcommittees and as the education committees, to get a standard written, which may be aligned with BESA, the BESA Academy and BESA training, but there isn't anything that's endorsed yet other than by independent providers at the moment. But I would say that's your start point now. It's better than nothing. You shouldn't just be sending people out there. Don't get an electrician to go out and start doing your fire damper testing, because they won't know what they're doing. Likewise, don't
I think George, you'll agree that part of the driver for VH001 and the second edition amendment as well was to detail precisely on a output based basis what testing should have and what reporting should provide, because by its very nature, the detailed reporting that you went through, Peter, at the beginning of the presentation requires a serious level of knowledge and understanding.
It does. Yeah, it does.
That you can't circumvent. So we've tried to tackle it in the short term with that, and at the longer term or short medium term, we want the training and certification to be the key and the focus.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's encouraging to see that BESA have got things in hand to be doing that. So it's just a question of time. I think, and it's actually obviously an urgent request, and I think it's been treated like that as well. I know you're involved heavily with it, George. Seeing a few emails going around, so that's good news to sort of see it's happening. Very good.
It's clearly resonating with the audience as well, because there's actually quite a few questions on that subject. Yeah. So it does show there is a concern about that and a demand for it, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Slightly related to competence, a couple of questions on this. I mean, one of them just says, does it matter which rear end the damper is fitted? The other question is a little bit more detailed. It actually says question for Graham, but I'm not going to answer it because I'm chairing this and you guys are answering the awkward questions. But the question is, can BESA have any input with damper manufacturers regarding labelling for the correct positioning of dampers, right around, for example, and serial numbers for any dampers requiring replacement, as most seem to put labels on damper framework installed into the fire barriers, inaccessible for the information required for compatible like-for-like dampers? That's a good point. No point in putting a label somewhere that's going to get built into a wall, is there? No,
that's a very good point, actually. Yeah, I mean, hopefully people know which way up they've got to go. I mean, I've seen installations where the blade has been on the bottom or on the side or something, but generally, of course, depending on the manufacturer, you've got to follow their instructions. And yeah, I quite agree that if some manufacturers are putting labels in the wrong positions, perhaps we can encourage them to modify their actual manufacturing information as well. I think that's probably a good point. Very good point.
Do they not normally have an arrow for direction of flow?
Yes.
What they did, the ones I've seen did.
They do, yeah.
Yeah. So there's not a lot of excuse for putting it back to front then, really, is there?
No, a lot do. But again, it goes back to that golden thread. You should have the O&M manuals for the building. Ideally, and that should specify what damper types were used in it. So if you get that at the start of the project, you can say to all your testing engineers, here's the damper types that you should expect to see. Here's their fixing instructions. Here's their operating instructions. You can give the testing engineers then the heads up on what they expect to see. So if they see something that's different, they'll ask the question, why? Why am I finding different dampers?
Yeah. You can only have the issues we find within the industry of inaccessible, untestable dampers if they were installed and it wasn't clarified at that point that they are accessible and testable.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Yeah.
Well, we know that's the fundamental underlying issue. But somewhere along the line, this has got to change, and that's relevant. From the Hackett Review talks about aspects like that all the time, about getting it right from the outset.
Yeah, I think there's no excuse for new builds now, really, is there, to get this right, and everybody's aware of it. I mean, as you know, BESA have got the other document out, a joint document with fire penetrations. That's all very much part of what we're talking about as well, of course. So if we can go forward with new builds being built correctly and fire dampers installed correctly and allow you to maintain them correctly, then we're at least onto a bit of a winning start, if you like. But it's going back on the historic work that we've got, and there's obviously millions, as we said, of fire dampers actually that need to be maintained. Yeah.
Well, obviously, as you said earlier, it's easier to address the new builds and the new ones going in, and I think you probably answered this one earlier, actually, Richard. The question again is related to this and saying, in new builds, typically there's a lot of other installations taking place around with other engineers. What should be happening at commissioning stage to avoid the dampers becoming inaccessible? But I guess that's the responsible person would be, as you answered earlier, Richard.
Interestingly, we've had two clients recently, one a big sports stadium, who are talking about not allowing anyone on site with a drill. I don't know if you've come across that, George. You're going to have the equivalent of a permit like for hot works, because once they sort out all the issues with the fire stopping, which are invariably linked to the issues we're talking about on fire dampers, they've got to start as they mean to go on, and the only way to do that is to stop someone coming on site and going, I need to throw a cable through there. So that might just be one of the many developments that, as part of the ongoing professionalism of everything related to building.
Well, we have seen some horrific sort of sites as well where cables have actually passed through the fire damper, haven't we?
Yeah.
So
why not? It's useful. That's the easiest route through, isn't it? Just put it through the hole, stick it through the wall, pull it through. You
put it through the ductwork. Yeah.
The best one I ever saw was a BT comms box in a fire damper, wedged in between an actual telephone linkage exchange box in a fire damper. That was quite impressive.
What to keep the blade open, or?
Well, I think they just put it in there and routed. They had all the telephone wires running through the ductwork as well. It was quite ingenious. So yeah, you do see some amazing things, and Unistrut holding dampers open, and even the delivery labels and clips still left on dampers and things. You're right though. I'm going back to what you said about the commissioning stage. That is the point where these problems can be caught initially, and unfortunately, from what I see, quite often the commissioning documentation for the fire dampers, it doesn't align with what we're asking for in VH001. Too often it's a simple tick box checklist. Is damper accessible? Yes. Has damper been drop set and retested? Tick, tick. No visual evidence. So we need to make sure that commissioning process is more robust, so we stop that being a problem when the building is handed over.
I've heard in more than one situation, on more than one occasion, I've heard that someone's saying, "Oh yeah, we test between 10 and 20% of dampers after the install to make sure everything's right." And it's like, where did you get that from?
Yeah, and only the easy 10-20% as well, I suspect. Yeah.
One thing as well, Graham, when we were talking about the dampers and being able to identify them correctly, it's a very important point, because if you have a failure of a component part on that damper and you can't identify what that damper is, then really and truly the only way to restore the integrity of that device is to replace it, and replace the entirety of the whole fire damper, because you can't just replace a component part hoping it's the same.
To replace the whole fire damper.
Exactly. It's a really important thing for people to understand, because the fire damper is a tested component. You know, it's a tested structure in its entirety with the fusible link and its closure mechanisms, springs, etc. So you can't just go along and put another fusible link on it, for example, because it hasn't been designed and tested in that complete assembly. So if you have a failure and you are not able to identify that particular damper type and that exact part, then really the only full way to restore the integrity is to replace that with a new component in its whole assembly.
And amazingly, you've actually managed to just answer the next question before I've even answered it. Asked it. So thank you for that. Yeah. Seriously, the next question I was saying, if you've got a broken fusible link and you don't have the manufacturer's ID, should you replace the whole thing? So obviously the answer is yes. Is it obligatory though for the installers or landlords to ensure the manufacturer's ID is in place?
Well, the O&Ms, the O&M manuals under the CDM regs and things, you know, that sort of information should be being retained and should be being fed down from the principal contractor all to the person who then takes ownership of the building at the end of it. Whether you get access
again, the golden thread aspect.
Again, unfortunately, yeah, it's just repeated. But getting access to that, we quite often. My business partner, he's the best at it. When people say, oh no, we haven't got any drawings, he just stands there deadpan and looks at them and goes, I think you have, you just haven't taken the time to find them. Because in a lot of these buildings or in historical records, the drawings will be there, but they're in a massive file or a huge directory on a hard drive. So it takes time to find it, but taking that time at the start of a project will give you so many rewards and useful information that the contractors going out there doing it, they must get that information wherever
it's part of the brief, isn't it, to provide record drawings and record documents. So they should be there. As you say, people just don't know quite where they are, perhaps. Obviously, you can, if it's a manufacturer that you know with a fire damper, of course you can go back to that manufacturer and get another correct fusible link to replace it with. So as long as you're using the same one, it's from the same manufacturer, then that's fine. As long as you've gone back and made sure that it is.
It's compatible.
It's compatible, yeah.
Okay, we are rapidly running out of time. I can't believe this hour's flying again, and there are way too many questions to answer today. So I'm gonna try and shift the debate a little bit and try and do a few rapid questions just to try and get some of them in. A nice easy one first, hopefully for you, Peter. I think. I mentioned in my opening bit that DW145 is out for review and that VH1 will be integrated into that. Do we have an expected timescale for DW145 review?
No, obviously it's going to be as soon as possible. There's lots of things that overtake it, of course, but certainly during this year we would be expecting to get that document out and completed. And there's a lot of new things happening with it as well. We're talking to manufacturers about all sorts of things. There are different style of dampers available. They're not all shutter type fire dampers, of course, so we do need to cover lots of aspects, and VH001, of course, is part of that, and many other things as well. So yeah, I'm aiming for the end of the year certainly to get that out, hopefully with a lot of help from colleagues and other companies as well for input. We have a panel pretty well set up, just need to make sure that we get together more frequently if possible to get this moving.
Okay. Yeah, no, I totally agree, and it's probably my responsibility to do that, so I better do it. There's actually quite a few people asked about getting DW145 updated, so it's again, clearly there's a demand for it.
Yeah.
Okay, another hopefully quick one. Is it mandatory for installing access hatches to dampers if recommended after testing? So this would be if you've gone and looked at an historical building, historic installation, and you've recommended that you need to install access hatches. Is it an improvement requirement under a non-compliance, or is it an order? Is it a mandatory requirement?
It's all part and parcel of compliance with the FSO, isn't it? So if George says you wish as the client, as the responsible person, to risk assess the fact that one of your dampers isn't accessible, needs a hatch out of 1,000, logic tells you that that's an understandable decision to make. If we come on site and 30% of your dampers need builders' hatches or access panels, you clearly need to install them, otherwise they aren't operable.
Yeah, and most ductwork systems have been installed to DW144 or European standards, but 144 covers that as well, and the building regs would be stating 144. So Yeah, all ductwork should be installed to 144, which means that every fire damper, of course, should be with access doors. So this should be there.
Yeah. Probably last question, because I suspect this one is going to spark a little bit of anger or confrontation from you. I don't know. There's a couple of questions that are a little bit linked here, and I think they're very relevant. We've touched on this a little bit, but somebody's saying an issue we see working as maintenance provider is that building ownership is often short-term. Consultants will often specify service, smoke, dampers, quantity, all, as they don't know how many there are. Contracts are awarded based on a nominal sum, and I think we've all seen contracts awarded on that kind of basis before. Someone else is saying, why has this been ignored for years? Shouldn't fire risk assessments pick this up, which are carried out or reviewed regularly? Discuss.
Yes.
It does seem to be an issue that's been largely overlooked, I think, by building owners, isn't it? And obviously, I think we've covered earlier on talking about the Grenfell inquiry and what's come out of that, and the building safety bill that's coming out. That's obviously moving the agenda on very much.
Yeah, I think you know, the older buildings, a lot of them when they were built, of course, you would have had an on-site supervisor. You'd have a clerk of works coming around checking to make sure all these things are happening. We've had a period where perhaps buildings have not been checked as they've been finished, completed. Someone comes in after the building's handed over, like I say, the high-tech sort of guys come in with their computer wires and cables and undo lots of things which have perhaps already been done, drilling holes here and there. So yeah, we do need to keep records. We need to make sure that people are checking these systems, and by doing what we're doing with testing now, we can start keeping records of fire dampers so that we know exactly what's happened in the past and that they are maintained annually. This part of it is what we're trying to achieve. The older buildings, and yeah, I agree, they're pretty bad. Probably you have a period of the last 20 years, I think, where they probably just got a fire damper in, and there's some pretty bad ones out there, I think. So hopefully from here on in, we'll start to educate people, and not just here on. I think probably the last year or so, people have been much more aware than what they were previously.
It's not new. This isn't a new requirement. This has been a requirement since BS quadruple 9 in 2008.
Yeah.
It was changed slightly in 2017 when they revisited it. It's not new. It's just people weren't aware of it, or they were choosing not to do it. But obviously, in light of Grenfell and things like that, this just highlights the importance of it. You know, it's part of that, the protection of that building. It's very, very important. Just to say, well, we haven't been doing it before is not acceptable. You should have been.
I think the understanding and awareness has changed. Nothing has changed. Take, for example, just fire stopping in buildings. Most people who are involved in anything to do with M&E in a building have been aware of a number of fire stopping issues throughout the building. It hasn't been top of the agenda, and there's always a limited resource, and there's always been a focus. And the current focus, because of Grenfell, has moved strongly towards everything related to fire, and that's just one part of it.
Yeah. Okay. I've got way too many questions here. Normally we would say at this point, because we have run out of time, normally we would say at this point that we'll put questions up on LinkedIn and people can go into the LinkedIn account. We may put a few of them up, but I think there's a couple of the questions that come in that are quite specific. Peter, I'm going to share the question list with you, if you don't mind. And maybe addressing some of them directly. That would be good.
Peter, we'll volunteer for that one.
Okay, well, we've had a few, and I know some aren't easy to resolve. I know. Yeah,
and in fact, the person that asked the question about the builder's work has actually come back and said, "I understand my previous question is contentious, but given some more about that, I'll leave that with you to follow up on." But we have run out of time. So once again, thank you very much. I mean, I think the number of questions, 87 questions on this list here. Wow. And I think we've managed to answer about 15, which is more than I normally manage when I'm sharing these things.
Graham, more than happy for us to try to provide some answers afterwards if you want to share them with us.
I will do that then. Thank you very much, Richard. And you've just volunteered George as well. So excellent.
Thanks very much.
Much appreciate that. Yeah, thanks very much again, guys. That was very, very
Thank
useful.
you.
And I think the number of people who registered for this, the number of questions that have come in show what an important subject this is. So we may even think about running another a repeat webinar down the line. Maybe once we've got the training up and running for the competence
Yes, very good.
side of it
Yeah.
signed up. So
Okay.
thank you very
I'm glad
much.
it's gone.
That
Good.
was excellent. Very good webinar.
Good.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just to inform people, the next webinar we have is next Wednesday rather than next Tuesday. So it's 28th of April, upskill your workforce and prepare for change. We have Helen Hewlett, our Director of Training and Skills, coming on to discuss training and upskilling of staff, particularly with a view to supporting government in the net zero targets. And I'm apparently a panelist rather than chair next week, so that's good. But I'll have to do some homework. I'll be discussing about heat pumps and the bad coverage that heat pumps have had, and why we're doing some upskilling training for that. We've also got Ewan Sutherland from Worcester Bosch is coming on the panel with that next week, so that should be another good one. As always, final messages, don't forget to follow us on our BESA LinkedIn page and Twitter at the BESA Group, sorry. And with that, we'll draw it to close. So thank you very much for attending again, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you all again next week. Thank you.